Hey, welcome back to the NOTCAST, number 312. Today is the 20th of August, 2023. I think I might start all of them with this, going in and out like that. Because I can. I think it's funny, and I have a terrible sense of humour, as you probably know. Seeing the phrase on air always reminds me, firstly, of the tagline for the film Truman Show, which is on the air unaware. But it also reminds me of the 1994 Stanley comedy with Steve Buscemi called Airheads that I saw at the cinema in Leicester. Airheads is not great. It's not even the one that's given the world the Steve Buscemi meme of "How do you do, fellow kids?" which is pretty surprising. So I'm going to stick this up here where it belongs. Look at that. An in-camera stunt there. And today I am going to be talking about Pink Floyd 1970. It's the 20th of August 2023, which means 20 years ago right now. I was in a park in Chelmsford making the gut-wrenching decision to see Underworld instead of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, which, by the way, was a no-brainer. It took me about that long. I figured I could watch 5 minutes of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, walk over to see Underworld on the other stage, and have a much better night than everyone that was watching the Red Hot Chili Peppers, which, considering the Red Hot Chili Peppers are one of the very worst bands in the history of anything ever, even worse, in fact, than Shed 7, I think I made the right decision. There are only about 700, 800 people watching Underworld in the field because there were 70,000 people that were crammed in trying to watch the Red Hot Chili Peppers. I don't get it, but I don't need to get it. You know, if I was in charge of everything, then obviously the bands I like, which aren't huge, would be the biggest bands in the universe, and everybody would be watching them. And then I'd be in a stadium going, it's not as good as it when nobody liked them. In the days when they were hopelessly poor, I might have loved them more. Yeah, I better stop rambling. Today I'm talking about Pink Floyd in 1970, and this is a pretty busy period for the band. There are 3 solo albums, a soundtrack album, a proper studio album, a live album that was recorded and not released, and about 3 or 4 other live sessions that have later been released. So super busy year for them. And as mentioned in my previous episode, the first thing that they did was a soundtrack to a film you may have heard of, Zabriskie Point. Here is perhaps a slightly racy cover to the original 3-track soundtrack album from 1970. At this point, I think Pink Floyd were struggling a little bit to work out what they were going to be in future. What records were they going to make? What were they going to sound like? What path were they going to take now that Syd had left the group 2 years previously? You know, they hadn't really done a full studio album since Syd's departure 2 years previously. They'd done obviously Sourceful and Secrets, which was a hodgepodge compilation of sessions with Syd and with David. They'd done the soundtrack to More. They'd done Ummagumma, which is half live and half solo studio recordings. And they'd done the soundtrack to Zabriskie Point. What they hadn't done is they hadn't actually done a new studio album of new material since 1968. So they were kind of like trying to find out what direction they were going to be in, whilst also trying to pay off the debt that they'd paid to Syd for him relinquishing his rights to the Pink Floyd name, and also touring. So Zabriskie Point, as I've mentioned previously, recorded in December 1969 in Italy. I think it was about £800 a week they got paid for it, which was quite a lot of money. And the way that they did soundtracks actually is very, very similar to the way that Tangerine Dream did soundtracks, which is that they didn't score to the film. They scored to themes and images that they got out through the film. So, for example, for Zabriskie Point and also for The Committee and for More, they kind of watched rough cuts and they looked at ideas around timings and what kind of moves they think they were going to go for. And then got some stills from the film and then kind of created mood pieces that could be used at any point within the cut of the film to make it work. It's an interesting way to approach an album. It's I think the way which makes for the most satisfying studio recording when you listen to it, because you might listen to the soundtrack to things like Star Wars, for example, Superman, other things that weren't necessarily scored by John Williams. It's down to the microsecond. It's down to the 1/24th of a second in the frame where the soundtrack is defined. And actually, for me, what that means is whenever you listen to the soundtrack album, you end up listening to a suite of songs in an arrangement that's been designed to work with a set of images that you can't see, which is a little strange, but it works, I guess, in one way. When we think of Star Wars, we always think of actually the Imperial March, which didn't appear until The Empire Strikes Back in 1980. And when you think of Raiders of the Lost Ark, obviously you think of the Raiders theme. When you think of something like Superman, all of these are John Williams ones, and they're all designed to match perfectly and synchronize towards an image which you can't necessarily see, which is why the John Williams soundtracks albums were often arranged for a concert suite, which was the recording that was issued on the record. And that means that it was a different arrangement of the same musical motifs and themes redesigned for the soundtrack. So and this, a lot of bands and a lot of soundtracks do this, is that they do two versions. They do the version that works for home listening, for the soundtrack album, a rearrangement, and you'll get this on things like Lord of the Rings, Avatar, obviously Star Wars, Superman, Indiana Jones, some of the Jerry Goldsmith stuff was re-recorded, and then you'll get the version that is the version used in the film. Which is a different recording which has the same motifs, the same themes, but it has a different arrangement. These days, now not quite defunct, Krautrockers, Tangerine Dream have a lot of their soundtrack albums are come in two forms. It's the soundtrack cues, the cues which are used for the soundtrack itself, and the versions that were rearranged, re-recorded, remixed, rethought, reimagined, to use a terrible word, for the home release. For Zabriskie Point by the Pink Floyds, we had actually three separate releases of the soundtrack for Zabriskie Point. We had this, which is the original 1970 soundtrack album that features Heartbeat, Pigmeat, Crumbling Land, and Coming Number 51, Your Time Is Up. And Coming Number 51 is a rearranged, re-recorded version of Careful With That Axe, Eugene. For the Zabriskie Point release in 1997, hang on a second, need to get it off the shelf here. What you had here is a 2 CD version of Zabriskie Point that has outtakes that are previously unreleased and had 4 previously unreleased songs from Pink Floyd. These songs are Country Song, Unknown Song, Love Scene version 6 and Love Scene version 4. Which implies that there's Love Scenes version 1 to 3 and 5 and a number of other tracks which haven't yet made it out. So that's your double disc version of Zabriskie Point. Nothing on here is on the Pink Floyd Early Years box set, by the way, so you have to own this as well as that to get the entire of the Zabriskie Point sessions. And in 2016, I can't believe it happened then, 2016, we also got the Pink Floyd Early Years box set. And the Pink Floyd Early Years box set, by the way, featured on CD 2, here it is, featured the soundtrack recordings from Zabriskie Point. So a grand total of something like 20 tracks. Let's quickly go through it. Now, 16 tracks, actually, with On the Highway, Auto Scene, Aeroplane, Explosion, Riot Scene, Looking at the Map, versions 1 and 7 of Love Scene, 2 versions of Takeoff, another couple of versions of Love Scene, and an unknown song, another take, and take 2 of Love Scene again, and then finally Crumbling Land, an alternate version of Crumbling Land. So effectively, you get about 90 minutes of music from the Zabriskie Point era that's sketched out over 2 or 3 releases. Really interesting stuff, the soundtrack to Zabriskie Point. Really worth listening to. I like what it does in terms of how it presents an instrumental, experimental side to the band, and it's ideal spreadsheet music. And what music am I going to listen to when I'm working with spreadsheets and things? And well, frankly, the soundtrack to Zabriskie Point, like Tangerine Dream and the John Carpenter soundtracks, is ideal for it, especially if you don't particularly want to work and you want a slightly threatening aura to the music you're listening to whilst you're chunking your way through a load of spreadsheets. I'm going to come back to the early years later on because there is some more gold in them thar hills. Because the first release from anyone related to Pink Floyd in 1970 was only on the second day of 1970. I've got a version here in the Syd Barrett Crazy Diamond box set, and that is Syd Barrett's first solo record, The Madcap Laughs, produced by David Gilmour and Rick Wright. The original vinyl version of it, well, this is my vinyl version of it, which is the Harvest Heritage double album that was released hot on the heels of the release of Dark Side of the Moon in 1974. This features the two Syd Barrett albums released whilst he was a tangible recording artist, The Madcap Laughs and Barrett, on a double LP. This is very similar to A Nice Pair, by the way, in case you were wondering, in concept and execution. Double album, designed to sell extra copies of The Madcap Laughs and Barrett. And it was, it says here, it's all composed by Syd Barrett, produced by David Gilmour and Roger Waters, with some tracks produced by Malcolm Jones. And I think David Gilmour plays on it as well. According to the credits on here, David Gilmour plays bass, and yeah, there you have it. Now, I think Syd Barrett is, I mean, he's very, very highly regarded, very well respected. He is a very unique talent, it's fair to say. And he has a very unusual approach to melody, composition, pacing, toning, lyrics, language. It's so incredibly British. It is actually you should possibly be given a copy of the Syd Barrett albums by the British Tourist Board when you land at Heathrow. It's because it's one of the most British things ever, certainly more British than Country House by the Blurs, and I'm not impressed by the existence of Blur at all, full stop. So we have the Syd Barrett solo album there, released on the 2nd of January. It's a strange listen because it has a lot of false starts. It has a lot of, oh, are you ready? Are you recording? 1, 2. It has a couple of false starts to a couple of the tracks, indicating perhaps Syd's not necessarily fully focused mind at the time of recording. David said what he wanted to do was inject some honesty into it by using the false starts, but as you know, not everybody appreciates those. I was listening to, I think, is it the Beatles' Hard Day's Night, the American version of the album earlier on, and I think when it was released in America, there's like a 1, 2, 3, 4 by Paul McCartney in front of one of the songs, and the engineer thought that was a mistake and just deleted it out. So even though it was intentional and left there by the band. Barrett and the Madcap Laughs did not set the world alight. The Madcap Laughs sold 5,000 copies in its first 2 months, which by now would probably put it in the top 10, but by then meant it probably sank without a trace, even despite Roger and David doing the production work on there. In 1993, there was the release of a Syd Barrett box set called Crazy Diamond. I'm not quite sure why 1993 was chosen as the year. It doesn't tie up with any major anniversary, unless you want to think, oh, it's 25 years since Syd got sacked, which is I guess one way of looking at it. This contains the original albums The Madcap Laughs and Barrett, and the Rarities collection Opal, which was originally released in 1988, plus bonus tracks of alternative versions and a 24-page book. And I figure we'll go into this now primarily because we can, and it has expanded CD versions of each of the 3 albums with bonus tracks relating to them. So on the Madcap Laughs here, we've got bonus takes of Octopus, It's No Good Trying, Love You, She Took a Long Cold Look at Me, and Golden Hair, all of which are perfectly cromulent, not amazing, but there you are. So these are produced by Dave Gilmour, Roger Waters, Pete Jenner, Malcolm Jones, and basically you can see why these were the takes that were used instead of the originals. Now there's if you want to be particularly snazzy about it, the cover art for Madcap Laughs is available in 2 versions on this CD, the revamped 1993 edition and this one, the OG 1970 version. The bonus tracks are not particularly good, it's fair to say. is the polite way of describing it. On the 24th of February 1970, we had the second major Pink Floyd related thing, which was a radio session by Syd Barrett, here released as a BBC EP on CD. Quite hard to get these days, I think, this. And this features Syd on guitar and vocals, David on this is David Gilmour here on organ, bass and guitar, and Jerry Shirley on drums, which is pretty odd, really, actually, because effectively that's half or 2/5 of one lineup of Pink Floyd, and it's an essential part of the Pink Floyd canon is to understand why the direction that Syd went in and the direction that the rest of the band went in, the two couldn't overlap on the Venn diagram of rock. They just couldn't intersect at all. But it is very, very definitely worth hearing to get an insight into where Syd was and what he was doing and the direction he'd gone in, which was very different from the rest of Pink Floyd. I think at one point Syd said something like, "Oh, Pink Floyd are architecture students, and you can tell when you listen to them," which is harsh, but not unfair, because their music was far more structured and far more constructed than Syd Barrett's, which felt very much, Syd's stuff felt very, very random indeed, like words just fell out of the air right in front of him, and he caught the melodies as they passed by, like clouds in the sky or something. I probably say too much in these videos, but I'm not quite sure how I can get round it. It's a standard human conjective to make sure that your brain doesn't have see, I've just done it. Make sure your brain has enough time to think around what it's going to put in front of you right next. So there you go. Right, so that's the Madcap Laughs and the pill session. We had the first of the other things which came out. So this was a grey label, unofficial, unauthorised live release that came out, I think, last year. It is Pink Floyd live in London 1970, which is the academic Foreningen Stora Saal in Sweden on March the 20th 1970. So this is a recording that clearly could have been included on the earlier set but wasn't. It's 2 CDs. It's an okay live recording. It's worth getting because at this point live Pink Floyd were quite improvisational. They had start and end points that were defined for certain songs, but the songs themselves kind of expanded and contracted depending upon how the band were feeling. And the nearest thing I can think of in terms of a comparison is the experiences I had when I was watching Underworld in the late 90s, the early 2000s, where effectively they were recreating the songs live on stage, not playing the album versions, but exploring the possible permutations using the bare bones and the basic ingredients to go, what can happen this time, and improvising within a set framework. So, for example, on here, Astronomy Domine, which is 4 minutes on the album, is 9. Careful with That Axe, which is 2 minutes 50 seconds on record, is 11:25. Embryo is 8 minutes. Interstellar Overdrive is 13, and Set the Controls is 11. These are available on YouTube, and they exist actually thanks to the EU's copyright laws, which is that the recording artist has the right to exploit the recording for up to 50 years after the date of the original recording, at which point, if it's not using and exploiting the copyright lapses. So you will see a lot of 50th anniversary copyright related records that are coming out. You'll see a lot of, like, for example, Bob Dylan 50th anniversary collections, where it's kind of saying, well, use it or lose it. If you don't release it, it falls out of copyright, and then there's no real reason for it to be protected, which is why the 1965 EP came out in 2015, and the 2016 was the release of the early years box set, because it really couldn't be released any later. Through the release of the early years, Pink Floyd at least gained a degree of control over a lot of their earlier material. I think they've taken a bit of a blind eye to the release of some of the unofficial live albums from the early 70s. But from 1972 onwards, they've started publishing on YouTube Pink Floyd copyright collections at the end of the year, which is effectively live, low-quality bootleg recordings that have been made available just really to assert the band's copyright on the material. They don't really want to release it, so they're not drawing attention to it. It's not necessarily easy to find the recordings, but those recordings are there and they exist. And that there was also the release of Lund, and at the same point we had a number of other releases which came out last year. This is the Fillmore West, recorded on the 29th of April 1970. This one features an 11-minute version of Embryo, so 2.5 minutes longer. Again, I'm not sure if this is officially recorded because I haven't heard it for a while, but if you want to listen to live Pink Floyd, early 70s Pink Floyd, actually is pretty much the best version of it. They also recorded a live album in Montreux on the 21st and 22nd of November 1970. I have a unofficial bootleg picture disc of Live at Montreux, which was here, featuring Atom Heart Mother on the B and Astronomy Dominate and Fat Old Sun on the A. Effectively, I think it was intended to be a replacement for Ummagumma and to then do something else, but they decided not to release the Montreux recordings. So we have here the 2 live shows at Montreux Casino on the 21st and 22nd of November 1970. Again, these were available on Amazon for about £10. These are raw but official soundboard recordings that potentially could have been a Pink Floyd live album that never happened. And again, the set list is broadly extremely similar to both of the nights. So Astronomy Domine, Fat Old Sun, Cymbeline, Atom Heart Mother, Embryo, Green is the Colour, Careful with That Axe Eugene, Set the Controls, A Saucer Full of Secrets, and then on one night a 15-minute version of Interstellar Overdrive. And on the first night we have Just Another 12 Bar and More Blues on there. These are really worth getting, by the way, if you're into your early live blues improvisational Pink Floyd periods. Although I'm jumping to the end of the year, I'm missing some other stuff that's happened. So as I've mentioned, on the 29th of April, the band played the Fillmore East that was officially recorded. On the 28th of April, they played a session at KQED TV, which was available on the early years box set, which is called Deviation. And that has an hour with Pink Floyd of Atom Heart Mother, Cymbeline, Grantchester Meadows, Green is the Meadow, Careful with That Axe, and Set the Controls. After the release of the box set, they found an extra recording off air of I think it's Astronomy Domine actually, but I'm not quite sure. And so all the surviving copies of this, by the way, are not taken from the original, because the original recording was lost by KQED. The surviving copies, including this one, come from a 1981 broadcast or a rebroadcast duplicate of the original that was used for the 1981 American television broadcast, by the way. Not very interesting unless you're deep into your film geekery. That is the 29th of April, and on the 16th of May, when the band were playing, I think in Denver, £40,000 of their equipment was stolen from a truck, because somebody who liked Pink Floyd knew somebody who worked at the FBI. Within 4 hours, that equipment was found. But £40,000 of equipment in 1970s money, that's a lot of money, and it could effectively have brought the band to an end, actually, and have definitely split over less than having all their equipment missing. On the 29th of May 1970, we got the actual release of the Zabriskie Point soundtrack in its various forms, which I've mentioned to start off with, because chronologically there's a gap between that and the release of the other things. And then we had some more touring whilst the band went in and out of the studio to record their upcoming studio album, Atom Heart Mother. On the 28th of June, they recorded some material at a session in Holland, which was Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun and Atom and A Source Full of Secrets in Holland in 1970, which I think was released on DVD 1 of... No, it wasn't actually. It was released on something else. Oh yeah, so this is the Kralingen Music Festival in Rotterdam. Rotterdam's a place I've only been through on a train, so I've only really seen its train station and its tunnels. But on the 28th of June, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun and A Source Full of Secrets were filmed and used for the multi-artist compilation film Stamping Ground. Now, the strange thing about the 70s is most bands didn't record most shows. YouTube or whatever was unknown. The home video market was unknown until Raiders of the Lost Ark was released on VHS in 1982 at £10. Before then, VHS tapes were about £80, and you could only really hire them from your local video store, or in my case, Blake's in Cottridge in Birmingham. And so if you wanted to see live footage of the band, it had to be recorded on film. It had to be shown in the cinema or on television. So, the DVD, VHS sell-through market didn't exist. This is why bands weren't running tapes for absolutely everything. This is why some Pink Floyd tours and, some Cure tours and Depeche Mode tours and things like that weren't filmed or released at the time, because there wasn't any market. It would have cost more money than the band actually had to release, and it would have brought not necessarily any guarantee of a release. So here is the poster for the festival, Holland Pop Festival there, and that was just 10 minutes of footage in a multi-artist compilation film compiling releases from or performances from the festival, so you can relive it at home later on. On the 16th of July 1970, by the way, ahead of the release of the band's upcoming album, they played a session at the Paris Cinema in London, which is next to Charing Cross Station, I think. And that is on the Deviation 1970 early years release, I believe. Pink Floyd live at the Paris Cinema, London. Quite how you've got a Paris Cinema in London. It's like having a Manchester Cinema in Leicester, for example. And that featured Embryo, Fat Old Son, Green is the Colour, Careful with That Axe, Eugene, If, and a 25-minute version of Atom Heart Mother with choir, cello, and brass ensemble. So yeah, there you have it. That's on the on this release. That was all in advance of the band's releasing their upcoming studio record, Atom Heart Mother. But we also, before that, had on DVD 2 of Deviation, we have an hour of Pink Floyd recorded live performing at the Pop Duo Festival in Saint-Tropez in France. It's an hour of really great Pink Floyd footage, which doesn't get enough reference, really. I think KQED is very well known. Saint-Tropez isn't really. It features a soundtrack of Cymbeline, as well as concert versions of Atom Heart Mother, Embryo, Green is the Colour, Careful with That Axe, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun. Really interesting to watch, actually. Also on the DVD is a version of Atom Heart Mother recorded at Hyde Park on the 18th of July 1970. The location, Hyde Park, where 35 years later Pink Floyd would make their last ever live appearance. On the 2nd of October 1970, or 10th if you're in the US, came the release of this lovely beauty, Atom Heart Mother, the band's studio follow-up to Saucer Full of Secrets, although they'd managed to avoid it by making it something like their 5th or 6th LP, even though it really is only their 3rd LP and the first studio LP recorded entirely with David Gilmour and not with Syd Barrett. So the idea behind the cover, by the way, is very simple. Is take a photograph of something. It doesn't have to have the band's name on. It doesn't have to have any imagery. Just the imagery itself will become strong enough to hold up the band's name and identity. It takes its name, Atom Heart Mother, from a newspaper article, which is around a woman who had a new pacemaker that I think was powered using some weird form of atomic energy, which I don't fully understand. If I fully understood it, I'd be in Oppenheimer and not here. And it's basically like the rest of the Pink Floyd albums. It's a cover of an object in a place where it doesn't necessarily really fit or is incongruous. You think of Pink Floyd covers, by the way. I'm going to digress slightly. But you think of objects in places where you wouldn't necessarily always expect to see them. Sure, you expect to see a massive, great big cow in a field, but what you don't expect is to just have a picture of a cow staring moodily at you as your album cover. Like, for example, Medal is a close-up photograph of an ear. Dark Side of the Moon obviously is the prism. Wish You Were Here is two people on fire shaking hands. Animals is a pig flying above a power station. Momentary Lapse of Reason is 800 beds on a beach. Division Bell are these two huge stone or steel heads in a field. It's like an incongruous kind of positioning of something in a place where it could exist, but the context doesn't necessarily feel right. It doesn't feel like that's what it should be. And Atom Heart Mother perhaps takes a slightly different angle in that, because it presents this picture of a pig in a field, and you look at it and you kind of go, that is a weird cover for an LP. That's just not what I expect at all. And that is why Atom Heart Mother is actually probably one of the best Pink Floyd covers there is, because instead of it being an object somewhere you don't expect it to be, the object is actually the image on the front of the record. Is you'd never think, well, for the record sleeve on the front we're going to have a cow, and on the back we're going to have 3 cows, and in the middle we're just going to have a field full of cows in black and white. And it tells you nothing about what's going to happen on the album. Maybe there's a degree of symmetry. You go, well, actually, there's 4 cows on the front and back sleeve, indicating the 4 members of Pink Floyd. But I think that's too much of an intellectual reach. I think that's somebody retrofitting what happened afterwards to try and make more sense of it. This is an original inner sleeve, by the way, on the grounds that it's very, very yellow and very old. And the sleeve there, or more correctly the label information, as you probably would have, mentions that the band are actually called The Pink Floyd, which is not necessarily what I would have expected it to say. The Pink Floyd, but there you are, The Pink Floyd, the Atom Heart Mother. I've never seen Atom Heart Mother, the title track, perform live. I have no idea if it's any good or not. What I do have, though, is obviously I've seen Nick Mason's Saucerful of Secrets perform a couple of tracks from this album, performing If, and I've seen David perform Fat Old Son, and I think I've seen I've seen Nick Mason perform the Atom Heart Mother title track with his band at Camden in 2019, which was later released on the DVD. This is the original inner sleeve, by the way, because it says To Chris, Love, Colleen, November 1976. If you are Colleen, by the way, or Chris, watching this, be assured it's gone to a nice, lovely, loving home, i.e. me. I've been looking after this one for years. I'm going to take good care of it. And I played it the other day. So in the summer, by the way, one of the things I do in the summers, I like to sit in the garden in the sunshine. I have a record player and a sound bar out and a book, and I might eat a food that tastes good but it's bad for you, or read a nice book and just feel grounded and feel a little bit away from the screen. Because there's a lot of time that when you're especially in our modern lives, almost all of our life is defined by what's on a screen. It's like a phone or a laptop or a television, and sometimes it's nice to disconnect and to sit with your feet on the ground, listening to something that doesn't come out of the screen, and read a book. And it's very relaxing, and books are some of the best of technology there are. They're almost as good as cats, actually. But there you are. But that's the digression, talking about the Atom Heart cover, the Atom Heart Mother cover. And Atom Heart Mother as a title track is the first of a couple of songs by Pink Floyd that are sidelong epics. It's like it takes the mantle of something like Saucerful of Secrets, which has about 4 or 5 different parts, and this one has about 6 or 7 different parts that were all performed mostly because of the limitations of the number of tape channels that there are. By the way, Abbey Road only had 8 tracks on its tapes, so especially when the band came to recording the follow-up album to this, Metal, they moved to Air Studios, which had 16 tracks, or another one which had 24 tracks. But recording this, for example, they had to play the rhythm tracks, Roger and Nick, live in one go, and so it kind of drifts in and out of time. So if you're listening to this with sheet music on, you kind of go, it's not quite precise. So, it's improvised, darling. But they went through multiple takes of it, and then obviously there was guitar and organ. But it's an instrumental sidelong track that's fucking glorious, and it works super, super well live. And then there was orchestration that was added by a musician and filmmaker called Ron Geesin, who will appear later on in this episode, to kind of create this sidelong epic. Side 2, by the way, and this is where I'll move to the CD version of it. This is the 1994 CD in a slightly different sleeve, which features. Let me just quickly check what's on here. I believe the extra tracks on side 2 are If, Summer 68, Fat Old Son, and Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast. Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast is a bag of shite. Sorry, Alan, it is not a great song. Here's a traditional Bedouin wedding feast on one side, and a original whatever that Frühstück kind of thing, and then the lovely booklet that comes with your CD features these details. 6 parts of the Atom Heart Mother title track: Father Shout, Breast Milky, Mother 4, Funky Dung, Mind Your Throats Please, and Re-Emergence. A number of photographs, which actually I've not looked inside this booklet for a very long time indeed, but all with a kind of a cow farming theme, and then kind of side 2, If, Summer 68, Fat Old Son, and so on. If, by the way, was never performed live by Pink Floyd on stage. It was performed once at the Paris Cinema, so you kind of get the impression that, they could have played it live, they just chose not to do so. And then here's some, and then there's lyrics and there's some pictures of some industrial farming machinery from way back when in the history of mankind. And are they any good? Well, I really like Atom Heart Mother. I think it's an underrated album. Pink Floyd's weird years have kind of been glossed over because the band didn't necessarily play those songs live a huge amount. Roger Waters hasn't played them live, and with very few exceptions. David Gilmour, I think, has only performed Fat Old Son from the early years live. It's really Nick Mason's Source Full of Secrets is where it's at. If you want to see a member of Pink Floyd performing early Pink Floyd material that's generally not performed by David or Roger, then you do need to go and see Nick Mason's Source Full of Secrets. I really like Atom Heart Mother, with one exception: the last track, Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast. Bag of shit. It's awful. It's a 13-minute sound collage of improvisational kind of, it takes its cue from some of the stuff that was on The Man and the Journey from 1969. The sounds of people, sawing bits of wood, or putting milk onto cornflakes, or cooking toast or something. And it's a space filling. It really is. The album would have far benefited from having an Embryo on there, and far benefited from having another track called Give Birth to a Smile. And Give Birth to a Smile comes from the soundtrack to a film called The Body. The soundtrack was released on the 27th of November 1970. It was a Roger Waters and Ron Geesin solo album, which was a soundtrack to a documentary that explored the human body. There are 4 acoustic Roger Waters solo tracks on here, those being Sea, Shell and Stone, Chain of Life, Body Transport, Breathe, not the version that appears on Dark Side of the Moon, and the last track on the album, track 10, Give Birth to a Smile. There's also Our Song, which is a Waters Geesin co-write, and the Womb bit. It has the rest of the soundtrack is done by Ron Geesin. It's kind of weird and abstract and a bit unusual, and probably would have sung without a stone had it not had Roger Waters' contributions in. The only track on this that's really genuinely worth your time is Give Birth to a Smile. And for Give Birth to the Smile, the last track on the album, which depicts both birth and the emergence of a human being from another human being through the act of giving birth, hence Giving Birth to a Smile, it's the only track on here which sounds like Pink Floyd, because David Gilmour, Rick Wright and Nick Mason were paid £150 each to be backing musicians to support Roger on that particular track. And it sounds like the great lost Pink Floyd song, actually, Give Birth to a Smile. I believe it was a promotional single in somewhere like Paraguay. And the strange thing with the soundtrack is it isn't really kind of structured as individual songs. There's no banding on there. Like I think Sgt. Pepper's has banding in America, and it doesn't have it in the UK, which means you can't really tell where the songs are. It's meant to be experienced as one whole thing. Give Birth to a Smile, last song, side 2. It's a brilliant song, actually, so unknown, so underrated. I would strongly recommend, if you haven't heard it, go for Roger Waters' Give Birth to a Smile. And if you have Atom Heart Mother, stop it before Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast starts and stick Give Birth to a Smile on as the last song. And it just ushers the album out on this glorious sea of optimism, which perhaps isn't necessarily something you would necessarily associate with Roger Waters, who is quite possibly the one of the most serious men in rock. His sense of humour isn't exactly amazing. Sorry, Roger, you do come across as very, very serious in your stage shows. So that's The Body, which was released on the 27th of November. And as I said before, on the 21st and 22nd of November, we had the Montreux performances, which were here on the unofficial CDs, which you should, if you get a chance, you should get them. These are great recordings of Pink Floyd live in 1970. And there was one more release from the band, which came out on the 13th of November, 1970. I have mentioned it before, but I'm going to mention it again. It is the second of the Syd Barrett solo albums, Barrett. This had a slightly different lineup. So there was Syd, David Gilmour on guitar, drums, organ and bass, and then Rick Wright on organs, piano and keyboards. And this was the last of the albums recorded by Syd. During the recording process towards the end, Syd effectively refused to leave his room, which could have been interpreted as having a nervous breakdown. It was a form of withdrawal from withdrawing participation in the established conventions of society. He became far more interested in painting, and with painting he would never repeat himself. So the idea of artistic exploration. So this is the 1993 version of the CD here. Again, comes with bonus tracks. As per the previous version, it comes in a slightly different sleeve, in so much as you can have a 1993 sleeve on there, and it features a number of absolutely great tracks, but then some extra bonus numbers, which are effectively alternate takes of Baby Lemonade, Waving My Arms in the Air, I Never Lied to You, Love Song, Dominoes, which I've seen David Gilmour play live, and It Is Obvious. Is it any good? Well, it's very clearly the sound of a man who has a more distant relationship with the established conventions of reality than his previous release. You can go right. So the first one's out there, the second one's really out there, the third one is was never recorded, was never released, although it later kind of got an appearance in 1988 as the album Opal. Again, here is the 1993 version with alternate takes of Gigolo Art, It Is Obvious, Clowns and Jugglers, Late Night, and the fabulously titled Effervescing Elephant, which beat Purple Parallelogram into a cocked hat. So take that, even Noel. And then the box set has a 24-page booklet, photographs of tapes and things like that. They're kind of like an insight into perhaps the strange and unusual world of Syd Barrett, as was before he made his final withdrawal from anything resembling so-called reality. This is the vinyl edition I've got of Barrett, which is the 1974 Harvest Heritage double album version, which was released to exploit the commercial success of Dark Side of the Moon. Probably sold more than 5,000 copies. And this was, I think, the period 1970 where Pink Floyd really stepped into what was going to become phase 2 of their career. So that was the period immediately before Dark Side of the Moon. So that's Atom Heart Mother, Zabriskie Point, Obscured by Clouds, Medal. It's a short period, it's only a few years, but it's where Pink Floyd really became and started to establish, I think, some of the things which they were going to do for the future. They'd had three top 10 LPs at this point. They were able to earn money from their activity and from royalties. They'd paid off their initial advance that they signed with EMI, and the band had kind of settled into their working methods for the next few years. Roger kind of moving into the idea in his mind, although he calls himself the creative genius of Pink Floyd on his posters, that's a very modest way of describing what he was doing. He's like the conceptualist and the lead songwriter. Gilmour in kind of like the number 2 position, as somebody who has texture and sound and writes some songs of his own, including, of course, Fat Old Son, which is fantastic. I didn't know what it was the first time I saw it played live because I hadn't got some of the early Pink Floyd solo records. Rick Wright in the 3rd position. That's probably the least prolific of the songwriters, and then Nick as number 4. His role was more as a kind of a glue and a conduit. It was piecing things together, and somehow Nick's touch turned whatever it was from a solo track into a Pink Floyd track. I don't quite know how he did it, but he did it, and without him, it just wasn't the same really. Which is good because he plays on every Pink Floyd album. He's the only person that ever did so. So that is 45 minutes on Pink Floyd in 1970, on Atom Heart Mother, on well, it was a Brisky Point, on Barrett and the Madcap Laughs, on The Body, and on the early years material as well. It's an underappreciated part of the band's legacy and history. And if you're a fan of Pink Floyd, I'd strongly recommend getting into 1970 because firstly, there aren't going to be any more Pink Floyd albums. Secondly, that last one, The Endless River, which lots of people didn't like, makes a lot more sense once you hear things like Atom Heart Mother and Meddle and Obscured by Clouds. When you hear those, you then kind of go, so that's what The Endless River is trying to do. It's a modern version of that version of Pink Floyd, and not the version of Pink Floyd that did things like One Slip and Another Brick in the Wall. That kind of wraps up 1970, which is good. Surprising, really, considering I never spent a second alive in 1970, that I've been able to do 46 minutes and 17 seconds about it. But that is the way the cookie crumbles. It's been a really interesting process of discovery for me, doing this and doing all these NOTCASTs, because what I'm doing is actually I'm going back and I'm revisiting things that I bought at the time, or I bought much long after the time. I can't. Well, that's very good, but I don't really get it. I'm going to come back to it later on, and then through the point of doing these is the process of discovery for me is to listen to these albums again and go, oh, that's what it was all about. That makes a lot more sense now. And there are still things which even now I'm kind of discovering as I go through. So if you've been watching this or watching previous episodes so far, thanks for watching them, and thanks for making it to the end of this one. Also, I've had some lovely comments recently from viewers. They've said nice things about them, which is really strange because for me, I have no idea who watches these, if anybody watches them. I certainly have no expectations. Sometimes I've run into randoms. They're not really randoms, but randoms in the big bad outside world, and they've started talking about how they've watched these, and I'm like, wow, somebody actually watches these. But that's, a lovely part of it, because I've no idea who watches these. I know some people don't like it. I know some people do. If you don't like it, as is your prerogative and your privilege, watch something else. I believe there are some unsolved murders going on in CSI Miami right now that you need to get to attend to. But if you have watched the rest of these, obviously, please do subscribe. Say nice things about me if that's what you want. Don't if you don't. I'm going to go downstairs, and because it's rather warm and it's still August and it's still summer, I'm going to have an ice lolly and I'm going to cool down, and I'm going to feel quite relaxed for a Sunday evening. So stay beautiful, and see you all again, hopefully sometime soon. Adios.